John had always prided himself on being perceptive, particularly when it came to his marriage. He knew the ebb and flow of his relationship with Emily, the little rituals they shared, the way they would laugh together after a stressful day, the familiar hum of conversation that filled the air when they were in the same room. But recently, something had changed. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but a subtle shift in their dynamic was making him uneasy. At first, it was just the small things, the way she started coming home later, or how she would bury herself in her phone whenever they did sit down together in the evenings. He'd noticed her seeming distracted, not fully present in the conversations they shared. Conversations, if they could still be called that, became fewer and further between. When they did speak, it was often about logistics. The kids, bills, the house. The deeper, more intimate conversations about their lives, their hopes, their dreams, had disappeared. Gone were the nights where they would talk for hours about their future, their shared plans, their love for one another. Now, it was all about managing the day-to-day. John tried to ignore it. After all, life was busy. They both had demanding careers. Emily had been working long hours at the law firm, climbing the ranks as a senior associate, and John, well, his work in the tech industry often kept him up late too. But despite his attempts to rationalize it, the nagging feeling that something was wrong kept going. It wasn't just the absence of deep conversations either. John had started noticing other signs that troubled him. The physical distance was becoming more apparent. They hadn't been intimate in weeks. At first, he told himself it was just the stress of their busy lives. But after a while, the lack of affection began to feel like a deliberate choice. Emily had always been affectionate, always quick to give him a kiss before leaving for work, or when they were together on weekends. But now, there was none of that. She would get up, gather her things, and leave, sometimes not even acknowledging him with a simple hug or kiss goodbye. One evening, as they were both watching television in silence, John looked over at Emily. She was sitting on the couch, eyes glued to her phone. He couldn't remember the last time they had done something as simple as watch a movie together. The last time they had sat side by side, enjoying each other's company without the weight of their daily routines hanging over them. He wanted to ask her if something was wrong, but he didn't. He was afraid of what the answer might be. Instead, he cleared his throat awkwardly. Is everything okay?" he asked, trying to keep his voice light. She looked up from her phone, her face unreadable. "Yeah, everything's fine. Why do you ask?" John wasn't convinced. The tightness in her voice, the distant look in her eyes told him otherwise, but he let it go, not wanting to press her if she wasn't ready to talk. They had always been good at ignoring their problems, sweeping things under the rug, pretending that everything was fine when deep down it wasn't. Days turned into weeks, and the distance between them seemed to widen. John had always known that Emily was a private person, but now it felt like she was deliberately shutting him out. She was always on her phone, texting or talking to someone, and when he asked about her day, her responses were always vague, almost dismissive. "It was fine," she'd say, and then the conversation would come to an abrupt end. And then there were the weekends. Saturdays, which used to be their sacred family days, had become more and more filled with work. John would spend the day doing chores around the house, taking care of their 2 kids, while Emily would disappear into her office, her laptop open, working on cases, making phone calls. At first, he assumed she had just taken on too much. She had always been a driven, ambitious woman, but now he wasn't so sure. There were no complaints, just silence, the kind that built walls instead of breaking them down. One Saturday evening, as they sat down for dinner with the kids, John looked at his wife. She was absent, her mind clearly elsewhere. She picked at her food, barely tasting it. She smiled faintly when the kids asked about school, but the smile never quite reached her eyes. John, who had been trying to push aside his growing suspicions, couldn't help but wonder, was Emily unhappy? And if so, what was causing it? Was it something he had done, or had she simply grown tired of their life together? Later that night, after the kids were asleep, John sat in the living room, thinking. He had always been someone who tried to make sense of things, to find logical explanations. He couldn't understand what was happening, but the more he thought about it, the more a disturbing possibility began to take shape. What if Emily was planning a divorce? What if she had already made up her mind to end their marriage? The thought hit him like a punch to the gut. They had been together for 15 years, half of his adult life, and now he was wondering if it was all falling apart. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He began to replay every interaction they had over the past few months, trying to pinpoint when things had changed. It wasn't like there had been a major argument or some catastrophic event that had driven a wedge between them. It had been a gradual drift, little by little, until now it felt like they were living separate lives under the same roof. John wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but his gut was telling him something was wrong, and in the pit of his stomach he felt an unsettling certainty that Emily was no longer committed to their marriage. He thought about the conversations they used to have, the laughter they used to share, and it felt like a lifetime ago. The distance between them wasn't just physical anymore, it was emotional too. He began to wonder if Emily had already decided it was over, but was simply waiting for the right moment to bring it up. But why hadn't she said anything? Why wasn't she being open about her feelings? Was she planning to leave him, or was she trying to force him to make the first move? He couldn't understand her silence, but it only made his suspicions grow stronger. That night, as he lay in bed next to Emily, the weight of it all settled in. He reached out to touch her arm, but she pulled away slightly, as if she didn't want to be touched. John's heart sank. The touch of her skin, once so comforting, now felt cold and distant. The silence between them was deafening. The next day, John made a decision. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. Something had changed, and he needed to know what it was. He had to find out if his suspicions were true. But more importantly, he needed to protect himself, to make sure that if Emily really was planning a divorce, he wouldn't be blindsided. He didn't want to lose everything, his home, his savings, his future, all because he had failed to act. But John wasn't sure how to proceed. He didn't want to confront Emily yet, not without knowing for sure if she was contemplating divorce. He needed to do some digging to figure out whether his hunch was correct or if he was simply being paranoid. And so, in the days that followed, he began to pay closer attention to her behavior. He watched for any signs of her having an affair, any subtle clues that might indicate she was planning something behind his back. He knew it was a dangerous game to play, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time. As he sat at his desk one evening, scrolling through financial records and legal documents, a thought crossed his mind. What if he moved his assets? What if he made sure that, if a divorce was inevitable, he would at least be financially secure? He knew it was risky, but the idea of being left with nothing terrified him. After all, they had built their life together, hadn't they? Or had Emily already checked out, preparing for an exit without him? The seed of doubt had been planted, and now John couldn't shake it. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. His marriage was no longer the safe, loving place it once was. And that, more than anything else, was the most terrifying realization of all. John had always been a planner. He liked having control over his life, managing the things he could and minimizing the chaos that could arise when things spun out of his grasp. But lately, it had become clear to him that there was little he could control when it came to his marriage. Emily, the woman he had shared his life with for the past 15 years, seemed to be slipping away from him, and he wasn't sure why or how to stop it. The realization had settled in slowly but firmly. Emily was no longer the woman he had married. He couldn't pinpoint exactly when the shift happened, but the distance between them was undeniable. The playful exchanges, the tender moments, and the shared sense of partnership had all been replaced by something cold, distant, and, perhaps most terrifying of all, indifferent. As he lay awake in bed that night, his thoughts racing with all that had transpired, The truth became undeniable. His marriage was on the brink, and it seemed like Emily had already made up her mind to leave. He thought back to the last few weeks. Every little thing felt like a sign. Her absence, both physical and emotional, had been more pronounced than ever before. Every conversation, every touch, seemed to drift further from where they had once been. And yet, Emily had never said the words. She had never directly confronted him with her feelings. She hadn't even hinted at the possibility of divorce. No, she had simply become quieter, more distant, until John couldn't ignore the cracks in their relationship anymore. John's mind was spinning as he sat in front of his computer the following morning, sipping his coffee while looking at their joint financial accounts. The bank statements, which had always been a simple way to manage their finances, now felt like something far more ominous. He knew Emily had always been responsible with money, just as he had. Together, they had built a comfortable life. 2 kids, a nice house in a good neighborhood, a few investments, some savings, and a sense of stability that had once felt like an unshakable foundation. But now, as he looked at the numbers, he realized that everything he had worked for could be at risk if Emily decided to follow through with a divorce. The thought hit him with sudden force. He had to protect himself. If she was planning to leave, he needed to ensure that he wouldn't be left with nothing. It was a hard pill to swallow, but John wasn't naive. Divorce was expensive, emotionally draining, and financially destructive. He had seen it happen to friends, family members, colleagues, people who had been left scrambling to rebuild their lives after a divorce. Unbeknownst to Glenn, John couldn't allow that to happen to him. He had worked too hard to build the life he had, and he wasn't going to lose it without a fight. He didn't want to believe that Emily was actively planning her escape. He still held out hope that this was just a rough patch, something they could work through. But deep down, his instincts were screaming that this was more than a temporary rift. She was already emotionally checked out, and it was only a matter of time before the divorce papers were served. The first thing John did was review their finances in greater detail. He went over their joint bank accounts, their retirement funds, and their investment portfolio. Everything was in both of their names. It made sense, after all, they had built everything together. But now, it felt like an open invitation for disaster if things went south. What if Emily decided to take everything? What if she asked for more than half, citing her sacrifices during their marriage, or her career successes in the past few years? What if she had hidden assets of her own that he didn't know about? John knew that divorces often became complicated battles over finances, property, and assets, especially when both parties had significant stakes. He had heard horror stories of spouses hiding money, diverting funds, and using every trick in the book to gain an advantage. He didn't want to be caught off guard. He needed to make sure that if this was happening, he would at least have some leverage. He started by transferring some of their savings into his personal account. It wasn't a large amount, but it was enough to ensure he had some financial breathing room if things got ugly. He was careful, though. He knew he couldn't just move everything around without raising suspicion. Emily had always been meticulous about their finances, and if he was too obvious, it would only confirm her suspicions that something was wrong. John didn't want to give her the upper hand by being too secretive or too transparent. He had to walk a fine line. Next, he looked at their investment accounts. Together, they had several stocks, bonds, and real estate holdings that had appreciated over the years. John knew they had to sell off a few things to diversify his holdings. He couldn't afford to have all his assets tied up in one place, especially not with the threat of a divorce looming over him. So, over the course of the next few days, he slowly began to liquidate some of the more volatile assets and transfer the funds to a separate account in his name alone. He kept it all legal, of course, nothing that could be traced back to any attempt at hiding assets. He knew the risks involved in attempting to hide money or property in a divorce, and he wasn't stupid enough to think he could get away with it. Instead, he made sure to set up everything in a way that protected his financial interests. As he went through the motions of shifting his assets, John couldn't help but feel conflicted. He wasn't a dishonest person by nature. He had always prided himself on being transparent and fair, especially with Emily. They had always been partners, working together toward the same goals. But now, with divorce looming in the distance, the trust between them had frayed to the point where he no longer knew if she would be fair in dividing their shared assets. And would she try to take more than her share? Would she twist the truth in her favor, using his financial decisions against him? He had to prepare for all eventualities. In addition to the financial preparations, John also began to document everything. He knew that divorce lawyers could be relentless, combing through every detail of a couple's life together in search of any advantage. He began to keep track of their expenses, their communication, and anything else that could be used in a potential court case. He started to note down the times Emily had been working late, the moments when she seemed emotionally distant, and the instances where their children had noticed a change in their relationship. He knew it wasn't ideal to start documenting everything like some kind of investigator, but he couldn't afford to ignore any details that might later prove helpful. John didn't want to be doing this. He didn't want to be preparing for a divorce, especially when he didn't have all the facts. But at the same time, he couldn't afford to sit idly by and pretend that everything was going to work out. He had to protect himself, even if that meant taking these difficult and uncomfortable steps. It was around this time that John began to feel a sense of anxiety creeping in. He wasn't sure how long he could keep up this facade of normalcy. How long could he go on acting like everything was fine when in reality his entire world was beginning to crumble? The tension between him and Emily was palpable. They were living together but not living together. Two strangers sharing a home, pretending for the sake of the children, of appearances. John couldn't help but wonder if Emily suspected that he was on to her. Maybe she knew he was watching her every move, checking every detail. He had to be careful. One wrong step, and everything he had done could be uncovered. One evening, as John sat in his office reviewing legal documents, he realized that he had made a decision. Whether Emily was planning to leave or not, he couldn't sit by and let his life fall apart without preparing for the worst. It wasn't just about money, it was about control, and in the face of a potential divorce, he needed to have some control over his future. But even as he made these plans, a part of him still clung to the hope that it wouldn't come to this. He hoped that somehow Emily would open up to him, that she would share her thoughts, her fears, and that together they could figure out what had gone wrong in their marriage. But deep down, he knew it was unlikely. The walls between them had grown too high, and the distance between them felt unbridgeable. Emily poured himself a whiskey and went to the sink, and at that moment, John leaned back in his chair, exhausted. He had done what he could. He had prepared himself for what might come, but now all he could do was wait, and hope that he hadn't made a mistake in taking matters into his own hands. The days that followed John's decision to take control of his finances were a strange mix of tension, uncertainty, and a looming sense of dread. He went through the motions of daily life, work, family obligations, even brief moments of forced politeness with Emily, but inside he was constantly on edge. Every look she gave him, every word she said, felt like it held some hidden meaning, some cryptic clue about what was really going on in her mind. But his heart would race whenever she came home late from work, wondering if this would be the night she dropped the bombshell. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break, and when it came, it would shatter everything. It wasn't that Emily had been cruel or even confrontational in the past few weeks. In fact, she'd been somewhat cordial, polite even. But that was the problem. The warmth was gone. The spark that had once ignited their conversations, their plans for the future, had fizzled out completely. She had become distant in a way that was impossible to ignore. At night, she would lie next to him, but her mind seemed to be elsewhere. John had caught her staring at the ceiling, her body stiff and unmoving, her eyes glazed over in thought. When he tried to engage her in conversation, she would offer only the most basic responses. He began to question whether she was even truly there with him anymore. It wasn't until 2 weeks after he had begun moving his assets, carefully, cautiously, that the truth came crashing down. It was a Thursday evening, and John had just finished dinner with the kids. Emily hadn't been home for much of the day, claiming that she had a particularly tough case to work on at the firm. They had exchanged only brief pleasantries when she came through the door, but she didn't stay long. She was exhausted, she said. The kids were still playing in the living room when John found himself alone with his thoughts, sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through some old financial papers he had been organizing. Just then, he heard Emily's footsteps in the hallway. He could tell it wasn't the usual pattern of her walking from the kitchen to their bedroom. It was a slower pace, a deliberate one, like someone who had something important to say but wasn't sure how to begin. John looked up and saw her standing in the doorway, her face pale, her expression unreadable. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't even frowning. She just stood there, watching him as if she were measuring the space between them. There was a certain stillness about her, an air of finality that immediately made John's heart drop. "John," she said quietly, her voice distant, "we need to talk." He swallowed hard, immediately feeling the weight of those words. He had known this conversation was coming, but the reality of it was still jarring. He put the papers down on the table, his palms suddenly sweaty. He nodded, though his throat was tight. "Okay," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady, though he could feel the tremor of fear creeping up his spine. "What's on your mind?" Emily stepped into the room and closed the door softly behind her. She didn't sit down, instead leaning against the wall, folding her arms across her chest as if preparing for something. John noticed how stiff her posture was, how deliberately she avoided making eye contact. Her body language spoke volumes. "I've been thinking," she began, and John's heart sank. Those words, "I've been thinking," were often a precursor to something devastating. He had heard them countless times before, usually when a major decision had already been made in her mind. He braced himself for what he knew was coming. "I don't think this marriage is working anymore," Emily continued, her voice flat, devoid of the emotion John had hoped would accompany such a monumental admission. "I don't feel the same way I used to. I've been unhappy for a long time now, and I think we both know it." John felt the blood drain from his face. His throat closed up, and for a moment he couldn't find the words. He had suspected for so long that this was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like being punched in the gut. "Emily?" His voice faltered, but he managed to keep his composure. "Is this really what you want? Is this what you've been thinking about?" She shook her head, her eyes momentarily clouded with emotion, though she quickly regained her stoic expression. "It's not about wanting or not wanting, John. It's just the way it is. I've tried, we both have, I think. But things have changed. We've changed. And I don't think it's fixable." John's mind was spinning. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he couldn't let it show. He had been preparing for this moment in his mind for so long, yet he hadn't expected it to feel this way. There was no anger in her voice, no frustration, just a calm acceptance of what was to come. In some twisted way, it almost felt like she had been preparing for this conversation for far longer than he had. "So, you're saying you want a divorce?" John asked, his voice tight but controlled, even though his stomach was twisting in knots. His mind flashed back to all the things he had done in the past 2 weeks. The money he had moved, the investments he had liquidated, the legal documents he had started to prepare. But he kept his face neutral, unwilling to let his inner turmoil show. Emily's gaze dropped for a moment, her fingers fiddling with the sleeve of her blouse. She seemed to hesitate for the briefest of moments before she nodded, almost imperceptibly. "Yeah," she said softly, as though she were acknowledging a truth she had known for a long time. "I think it's time. I've already spoken with a lawyer." John's heart stopped. He had feared this, but hearing her confirm it was a blow he hadn't fully prepared for. She had already taken the first step. He tried to process this new information, but his mind raced in 1,000 different directions. "You've already spoken to a lawyer?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded, her face betraying little emotion. I'm not doing this out of spite or anger, John. It's what I think is best for both of us. And the kids. I don't want to drag this out. John's mind swirled with the implications of what Emily had just said. She had already spoken to a lawyer. She had already started the process of ending their marriage. He couldn't believe it was happening, not like this. He had hoped for a conversation that would reveal some deeper issue they could work through, some way to repair the rift that had developed. Instead, he was faced with this cold, final declaration. He stared at her for a long moment, unsure of what to say or do. Part of him wanted to beg her to reconsider, to ask her to stay and work things out. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't work. Emily had already made up her mind. The decision had been made. This was the beginning of the end. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, John spoke. I need some time to process this. Emily didn't argue. She simply nodded and turned to leave the room. Take all the time you need, she said, her voice almost hollow. I'm not going anywhere. But I think we both know this is the right thing to do. She left the room, and John was left sitting there, his mind reeling. Divorce. She was filing for divorce, and there was no going back. The life they had built, the memories they had shared, were all about to be torn apart. For the first time in months, John felt the weight of the reality that had been hanging over him. It wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the end of a chapter in his life. The life he had thought would last forever. The life he had worked so hard to build with Emily was slipping through his fingers. He took a deep breath and stood up, his knees weak. He knew what he had to do next. He had to protect himself. He had already made preparations, but now he needed to make sure everything was in place. There was no turning back. As the hours passed, John found himself sitting at his desk, staring at the computer screen, his thoughts a jumbled mess. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. This was only the beginning. The following days after Emily's revelation felt like walking through a fog. John had expected his life to shatter upon hearing the words, but nothing prepared him for the quiet devastation that followed. It wasn't that Emily had been cruel or that she had sought to hurt him in some overt way. It was her calmness, her detachment, that made everything feel surreal. As if the decision had already been made a long time ago, and all that was left was to carry out the inevitable. When he'd first heard the inevitable, John tried to focus on the logistics of what came next, but every step felt like trudging through quicksand. The kids, oblivious to the shifting dynamics between their parents, continued their routines as if nothing had changed. They didn't know, couldn't know, the fracture that had occurred beneath the surface. They still played their games in the living room, still asked for stories before bed, still came to John for comfort when they were upset, but John couldn't help but feel the weight of the impending change hanging over them all. How could he tell them that their lives, their family, was about to be torn apart? That first night after the conversation with Emily, John couldn't sleep. His mind was consumed with thoughts of what lay ahead, what it all meant. The divorce, the splitting of assets, the custody arrangements. Everything that had seemed so stable and secure just weeks ago now felt like it was slipping through his fingers. It wasn't just the financial aspect, though that was a major concern. It was the emotional toll. How would he navigate the loss of the life he had built? How would he cope with the reality of being a divorced man, a single father, starting over in a world that no longer felt like home? But most of all, John was angry. He was angry at Emily for not being honest with him sooner, for not giving him the chance to fight for their marriage. He was angry at himself for not seeing the signs sooner, for letting it get to this point. There had been moments, glimmers of suspicion, but he had convinced himself that things would improve, that they could work through whatever had been drifting them apart. And now he had been wrong. Now the consequences of his inaction were staring him in the face. 2 days later, Emily's lawyer contacted him. John had anticipated this, but receiving the official paperwork made the situation feel even more real. A divorce petition. It was brief, to the point, and entirely professional. There was no mention of the years of memories, the shared history, the family they had built. It was just a legal document, outlining the terms of the separation. John read through it carefully, the words jumping out at him as he tried to absorb the reality of the situation. There would be a division of assets, a custody arrangement for the kids, and a spousal support agreement. There were no surprises. Everything had been laid out in a way that made it clear Emily had already considered her options carefully. The next few weeks were a blur. John's life, once filled with the usual chaos of raising 2 children, managing a household, and working a demanding job, now revolved around lawyer meetings, paperwork, and endless phone calls with financial advisors. He had never imagined his life would be reduced to this. Arguing over assets, dividing the spoils of a marriage that had once been full of love and hope. But that was the reality now. Emily had made her decision, and John had to protect what was his, even if it meant letting go of everything he had once hoped for. During one of his meetings with his attorney, John was advised to make sure everything was in order before proceeding. The attorney emphasized the importance of being strategic, of ensuring that he wasn't left vulnerable in the aftermath. John had spent so much time over the past few weeks moving his assets around, but now he was instructed to start gathering documentation to ensure that the division of property was as fair as possible. It wasn't just about money. It was about the future, the children's future, his future. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Throughout this period, Emily remained relatively distant. They had a few conversations, but they were always brief and businesslike. The emotional connection had long since been severed, and all that was left was the legal negotiation. Emily, it seemed, was determined to move forward with her life. She had already started looking at apartments, making plans for the future, while John was still grappling with the devastation of what was happening. He couldn't understand how she had reached this point so easily. She seemed so sure of herself, so confident in her decision to leave, and yet he had always believed in their love. He had believed they could make it through anything. But now that belief seemed naive, foolish even. The woman he had loved for so many years, the woman he had thought he knew, had already let go. One evening as John was putting the kids to bed, he had a moment of clarity. It wasn't just the financial division of their marriage that would be difficult to navigate. It was the emotional distance that had crept in. The custody battle, the division of the house, the shared responsibilities, all of that was manageable, though difficult. But the emotional toll on him and his children would be far greater. He would no longer be able to share his life with Emily. He would no longer come home to her, no longer have the quiet moments they once shared. His kids would no longer see their parents together. The family unit he had worked so hard to build was crumbling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. John's anger had slowly transformed into a sense of resignation. He wasn't sure if it was because he had come to terms with the fact that Emily had made up her mind, or if it was because he simply didn't have the energy to fight anymore. The battles over money and property were one thing, but the emotional battles were something else entirely. They were draining. His mind and heart were exhausted. The hardest part of the divorce process, John realized, wasn't the division of assets, the legalities, or even the custody arrangements. It was the realization that Emily had already moved on. She had already let go of their marriage, and now she was determined to build a life without him. That was the wound that would take the longest to heal. As the days wore on, John found himself retreating into his work, focusing on the tasks at hand to distract himself from the pain. He spent time with the kids, made sure they were adjusting to the new dynamic, but deep down he was consumed by a sadness that he couldn't escape. He missed Emily. He missed the life they had shared. He missed the person he thought she was. But, in a way, John was beginning to realize something important. He needed to let go as well. He had been holding on to a version of Emily that no longer existed. He had been holding on to a marriage that had ended long before the divorce papers were filed. He had been clinging to the hope that they could somehow fix things, that they could turn back the clock and reclaim the love they once had. But that hope, he now understood, was unrealistic. Emily had moved on. It was time for him to do the same. A few weeks later, after the divorce papers had been signed and everything had been finalized, John sat in his living room with the kids, the house now officially divided. It wasn't the end of the world, but it felt like the end of something that had once been beautiful. The emotional scars were still fresh, but they were beginning to heal. He knew it would take time. He knew there would be good days and bad days, and that the pain would never fully go away. But he also knew that he would survive. He had to, for himself, for his children. As he watched the kids play, laughing and shouting in the living room, John realized something. He was still standing. He was still here. And in time, he would find a way to rebuild his life. He wouldn't let this define him forever. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be his. And that was enough.